Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I'm going to try and address very directly, very as succinctly as I possibly can, which is not that succinct, the question: why does Steven Erikson refer to Toll the Hounds as the cipher for the series The Malazan Book of the Fallen? This is book 8 of a 10-book series, and Erikson keeps referring to Toll the Hounds as the cipher, the keystone, the way of understanding what is actually going on in the rest of the series. Now, we did address this in a previous video, which I'll link, and I think it's about 22 minutes into that video, where it was myself, Dr. Philip Chase, and Steven Erikson were discussing Toll the Hounds, and we were discussing thematic elements, and we actually talked about this question. But a couple of people have not found that explanation as straightforward as maybe we thought it was. So I'm going to try and be very, very explicit here to talk solely about this one point. And in essence, it comes down to the fact that at the end of the prologue, by the way, this is spoilers for Toll the Hounds and back. I'm not going into stuff from Dust of Dreams or the Crippled God. That does have an impact on this, but I'm doing it solely from Toll the Hounds. So there's going to be a little bit of information left out here. In fact, what I might do is I'll tack it on the end. And I'll put a block in to show like spoilers, and in case you haven't gotten that far. But in essence, it comes down to the fact that at the end of the prologue, Krupp is again in his dream world. He is again in this realm that transcends the space and time of the Malazan reality that we have seen before in Gardens of the Moon, that Krupp's dreams are a metaphysical reality that breaks through all of the different narrative layers and the narrative time and everything that happens in the Malazan world, that it is a dream world. It is not bound by the laws of the Malazan reality because it's a dream. And we all know that dreams are illogical. And Krupp has access to this, which means he moves around in time. He sees things from different perspectives. But anyway, so Krupp is in his dream world, and he is talking to Krull, an elder god, and he is going to tell him a story. He's going to tell him about the events that occurred in Darujistan that we know as Toll the Hounds, the book 8 of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So what Erikson does with this is he identifies a specific narrator, Krupp. This narrator is a homodiegetic narrator. And I've mentioned this very briefly in other videos, but in essence, a heterodiegetic narrator is a narrator who is not part of the narrative, that they are telling a story that they have no part in. So for example, if I told you the story about Heracles strangling the snake sent by Hera into his crib, I wasn't there. I didn't witness any of it. I'm not part of that story, but I can narrate that story to you as a heterodiegetic narrator. I'm not part of that narrative. Or if you tell a story in which you are a character, you feature in it, not necessarily are the protagonist, but you could be a witness. If you narrate that story, you are homodiegetic. You are part of the diegesis. So if I told you a story about what happened during my Christmas, and when I met with my family and what happened at the Christmas dinner table, that would be a story in which I was a homodiegetic narrator, because I'm telling you a story in which I am a character and I feature in the story. So those are two different types of narrator. And Krupp in this is a homodiegetic narrator. He appears in the narrative, not in all aspects of the narrative, but in some of them. So he is a character in the narrative that he is about to tell. So he is homodiegetic. But there are other parts of the narrative in which he does not appear. So for those parts, we could consider him heterodiegetic because he's not part of that narrative. So that's the first thing to understand, that a narrator can essentially move between these two different positions depending on what is actually happening in the narrative. But in essence, Krupp is homodiegetic because he is part of the narrative that he is about to tell. So that's the first thing to understand. There is an identified narrator, that someone is telling you this story. Now, the second thing to understand from this is clearly Krupp cannot physically have witnessed all of these events. And you go, oh, but how can he then tell the story of it? Now, I don't know if any of you have ever read a Sherlock Holmes story or any of these murder mystery story or even seen a murder mystery, but there used to be this convention that in certain of these stories, the detective would call everyone into the drawing room at the end of the story, and they would then tell everyone how the crime happened. And they would go through all of the evidence saying, and then the murderer went and did this, and then they went in here and they stabbed the person like that, and then they hid the body over here, and then they did this, and it was all done because of this motive, and you the butler, you are the murderer. And you go, how can they narrate that story? They weren't there. And the reason is they had fragmentary evidence. They put this evidence together. From the evidence, they deduced what had actually occurred. Do they get every single aspect exactly right? No, but they get the general sense of everything that occurred, that they didn't hear all of the conversations, but they know that the conversation went something along the lines of that person was angry with that person, and that gave that person motivation because they were angry with them. And the other person was then fearful and it gave them motivation to attack that person. They create this, they illustrate it with illustrative dialogue, which may not be factually true, but is true to the essence of what occurred. So they, after the fact, look at the fragmentary evidence. They put the pieces of evidence together to create a cohesive narrative that explain the events. And this is an important aspect of homodiegetic narrators, because homodiegetic narrators and heterodiegetic narrators, in actual fact, do not necessarily have to be at the same temporal location as the events. And by this, I mean, they might be in a different time from when the events occurred. So Krupp is telling this story to Krull about events that have already happened. He is telling them retrospectively. He is at a point after the end of Toll the Hounds, and he is telling the story of Toll the Hounds after the fact. Therefore, Krupp knows what happened when he is telling the story. He already knows all of the different events. Because he knows all of the different events, he could have put all of the information together and then extrapolated from that information to explain how the events actually occurred, even though he wasn't actually there. Sherlock Holmes was never there for when the actual crimes occurred, but Sherlock Holmes, at the end of the story, was able to tell the reader and tell other characters what actually happened because he put all of the clues together. So if you think of it that way, Krupp is whatever, a month after Toll the Hounds has actually ended. He is meeting up with Krull and he's going to tell the story. And another piece of evidence that sort of goes to this, to explain this, is when Duiker and Fisher Kiltath are discussing the chain of dogs, that Duiker cannot bring himself to write the history, the proper history of the chain of dogs. And Fisher says to him, tell me what happened, and I will turn it into a story, because that way it will act as a filter. And it will not be the raw events. It will be a dramatization of the events that will tell the essential truth of what happened, but not necessarily the factual truth of what happened. And a way of thinking about this, and before you all cry cop out, is think of the number of films that are based on actual events, that they are dramatizations of actual events, where they have certain facts that they know, and then they have filled in the blanks to create a cohesive line that runs from the start all the way through to the end, and so that the story makes sense. That happens all the time. In fact, that happens a lot with how we construct histories, that when we have access to factual events about this battle occurred and this happened here and this character or this general did that, why did they get to that decision? And we look at some of the previous things that happened that we have facts about. And from there, we draw a link between the two and we try to understand their psychology and how that affected them. And sometimes we have additional letters, sometimes we have correspondence from different people, sometimes we have witness accounts. But we know that witness accounts are fallible. We know that people, when they perceive events, their memories are fallible, they misconstrue things, they misattribute importance to certain events, and they all interpret the events and the importance of the events differently. And so what an historian does, in some respects, is go through a lot of this stuff to try and find the cohesive nature of the through line, to try and find how it all fits together to show the causal links. And where do we find a lot of causal links? We find this in narrative, where we talk about the narrative events. Are these events that have causal links, where they are linked to each other? And one of the things, obviously, that happens in the Malazan Book of the Fallen is that these causal links are not necessarily direct events affecting one another, but have thematic links. And so when we think of Fisher Kiltath talking to Duiker, he's saying, tell me the general events of the Chain of Dogs, and I will turn it into an epic poem, a lay, or some sort of song, story. I will narrativize it. And by narrativizing it, I will turn it into something that there is a filter. So you're not traumatized by it. You're not reliving exactly what happened, but it will explain those events in a way that other people who were not present will understand. So it is not going to be 100% factually true. It is going to be a dramatization based on the events. So then moving back to Krupp, Krupp is now telling a story about what happened in Darujistan, but he is dramatizing the events. And when you read Toll the Hounds, there are sections of it in which Krupp directly comments on what happens. Krupp has an opinion about what happens. Krupp consoles the reader. Krupp tries to cheer up the reader. Krupp is telling this story to Krull, but by extension, is telling the story to us, and is very aware of the fact that this is a story, that this is a dramatization of events. It is not 100% factually true. It will be the general sense of what happened. It will make sense in terms of all of these different events. But if you'd had film cameras all around Darujistan, did every piece of dialogue happen the way that Krupp says it happened? Probably not. Did every event happen in the order that Krupp narrates it? Probably not. Did every event happen the way that Krupp tells them? You go, no, not necessarily. They could have happened at different times. Krupp has conflated characters. He has conflated time periods. He has conflated all of these different things. He has taken out things that he doesn't think are important. He's added in things that are important. He may have embellished. He may have dramatized an event. He may have added in a scene that he thinks explains how character A got from point 1 to point 9. He's put in these scenes to explain how they got there, like a detective filling in the blanks with the evidence at hand. So he doesn't need to have witnessed everything in order for this to be a story that he is telling. And he will tell it as if it actually happened. That is a mode of storytelling, but it's also a mode of history. Now, it's not one of the more common ways that histories are recorded today, but how we record history, how we talk about history, has changed dramatically over different time periods. There have been different conventions in place for how histories are recorded. If you look at a lot of the ancient Greek and ancient Roman histories, they are written in a very different style, not just language, but a different style about how they relay what is important. And when we move through like all of the different time periods, we see these different changes to our approach to understanding history. And history is not just the facts. History are the personalities involved. History is the perception of what happened. And all of these things are not 100% knowable. A lot of the time, historians have to step in and give their best guess that they extrapolate from available information. And with narrative, we know that authors and narrators deliberately do this, and they are open about doing this. But sometimes they pretend that, yes, this is exactly what happened. So I'm going to refer to a book here, quite a famous American novel, which is The Scarlet Letter. And of course, in Nathaniel Hawthorne's opening to this, he pretends that the book, The Scarlet Letter, that we're about to read is actually a found text, that he was digging around in the attic and he found this book, The Scarlet Letter, that had been compiled. And yet there are sections of that story where no one could have possibly witnessed the things. But we read that, it has a narrative perspective, it has a narrator who is telling this story, and we don't question that. But it's a narrative, it has a narrator. We don't ask, well, how did the narrator know that Pearl was saying those things and doing those things in the forest when no one was with Pearl? How does everyone know what Hester and, I've temporarily forgotten the name of the pastor, because in my head it's Dumbledore and it's not Dumbledore. But how does anyone know what happened in that sequence? Because Hester would never have told anyone, and the priest or the cleric would never have told anyone. And you go, we don't question that because it's a story. It is not a factual history program. It is a narrative, and the narrator takes liberties. They explain things. They take fragmentary evidence. They take these scenes and they construct links between them to illustrate for us, to make it palatable and easier for us to understand. And one of the reasons why Erikson refers to Toll the Hounds as a cipher is because this is made very explicit, that Krupp is narrativizing the events. This is not a true recollection of everything that happened in exactly the sequence that it happened. This is a story version of these events. And when we think of even something like one of the world wars, when we think of what happened in the trenches, we look at all of those films, Saving Private Ryan, that is based on true events. But do you think that all of those lines of dialogue, that exact sequencing of the different things that they went through, do you think that that is all exactly 100% factually true? You go, no, it's not. It can't be, because the people that would have witnessed that never wrote down exactly what everyone was saying when they were saying it. And the people then telling the story kind of fill in roughly what happened. And the filmmakers then create this story that has the appearance of truth because they're looking at the emotional truth. They're looking at the grand scheme of things. And the actual specifics are used to illustrate aspects of it. They are not necessarily meant to be considered, this is exactly what happened. And that is a big thing to remember about narrative. And when we think about the Malazan Book of the Fallen, one of the things from the very beginning that has been made clear is that this is a frame narrative, that this is a found text. And in that text, it is telling a story from a certain perspective. It has been compiled. And it is an old text. And when we think of any old history book, when we think of any of these ancient codices that have been left over, think of the Arthurian tales, even think of Tolkien's Legendarium, in which there are contradictory stories, variants of stories, things that where one thing happened one way, one thing happened another way. When we think of ancient Greece, we can talk about some of the various mythological things that happen that get compiled together. And you go, but how can that person have done that thing at that time and also done that thing at that time? That doesn't make sense. When we look at the Iliad, there are Bronze Age weapons and Iron Age weapons in the same story. When we look at the Odyssey, despite the fact that Odysseus is the grandson of Hermes, Hermes doesn't recognize him. He doesn't recognize Hermes. And in fact, Athena, for no apparent reason, is his patron. It sort of doesn't really make sense until you realize that the version of the Odyssey that we have was probably compiled when Athens was in ascendancy, and therefore you put the patron of Athens in as a very important character because it flatters the people of Athens for whom you're writing the story. That there are all of these things impact the narrative. So that is one thing to consider, that from the very beginning we have been told that these are events that there are thematic links running through all of this, that there are going to be inconsistencies. There are going to be conflations of events. Characters may be conflated. Other characters may be wholly invented. Scenes may not have occurred the way that they actually occurred, but what we're seeing is a variant of it. It has been dramatized for our consumption based on the actual events. And all of this, of course, is in the frame of this is epic fantasy and fiction. None of these things occurred. And therefore, narrative is always an artificial construct, even when things are based on actual events, even when someone is being as truthful as possible about what happened. It is from a certain perspective and it is a certain interpretation. And therefore, it is not ever going to be 100% true. And if you've ever had the opportunity to read witness statements from someone who's witnessed a crime, and you've read multiple witness statements, all people who have viewed the same crime, you will find there are some elements will match up, but other elements they will tell completely differently. Some witnesses will omit huge chunks of things and focus on different things. Other witnesses will go into a lot of detail about certain elements and then omit things that the first witness was talking about. They will misremember the sequence of events because everyone perceives events differently. They ascribe different meaning and interpretation to those events. And even then, their memories are all fallible because our memories do weird things to try and make sense of what's in front of us. So these are all aspects that are found in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. We see multiple perspectives all the time. All of these stories are being told from multiple points of view. The points of connection between so much of it is thematic, and that theme is going to be important to the narrator. And for Toll the Hounds, much of the narration is actually done by Krupp, not all of it. Toll the Hounds is Krupp's book. Krupp is telling this story. But Toll the Hounds, the book that we are holding, also has a prologue in it in which Krupp says that he is going to tell a story. And Krupp isn't narrating that, which means that the entire book has an additional narrator. And this is what Erikson is getting at in terms of it being the cipher for the series, that there is a narrator, that there is someone who has compiled all of these things, that there is a reason it is being told all of these different ways, that it is postmodern in that it is playing with narrative perspective, it is deconstructing narrative, and it is destabilizing the notion of truth and what happened within it, that this is a dramatization of events, if you will, but there is a reason and a through line through all of this. So I hope that explains why Erikson views this as a cipher. Now, we have seen aspects of this not only in Gardens of the Moon, but also when Trull speaks to Onrak at the end of House of Chains, before Midnight Tides. And Trull says to Onrak, I am going to tell you the story of how I got shorn. And we then have Midnight Tides, which is that story of how Trull was shorn. And of course, people then say, but how did Trull know all of those other things? And again, part of it is someone else has compiled the Book of the Fallen. Trull section, all of those things are bound up in this conceit of Trull telling the story of what happened to Rulad and the Sengar brothers and what the Letheri did. That's why we focus so much on Trull as we go through that story. But in order to understand all of those events, we needed the perspective of the Letheri. So the narrator of the entire series steps in and fills in the blanks for us. So Trull is telling part of Midnight Tides. That is his story told from his perspective and filtered through his perception of events. But the narrator has stepped in to add in additional information. So we see that in Midnight Tides. We see it explicitly in Toll the Hounds. So this is consistent across the entire series about what Erikson is trying to do. So brief break here, because there are now going to be spoilers for the whole series. So if you've not read the whole of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, please, thank you very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope this answers your question. And I hope to see you in the next one. For those of you who are still staying on, this is spoilers for the whole series. And it's one additional aspect that I'm going to add into this. Right? Just giving everyone a second to make sure that they've switched off. Okay, so I am presuming everyone here has read the whole of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So you know, in the end, Kaminsod, the Crippled God, has promised to write the Book of the Fallen. And when we look at the epigraph poem, or sorry, the epilogue poem, and we look at the poem that is the epigraph to the entire series, we see that this series, the Malazan Book of the Fallen, this 10-book series in front of us, is bookended by these two poems describing a figure taking up an old tome, essentially the Book of the Fallen. And this is then suggesting that what we are going to look at is a found text, a compiled history. And this history has been compiled by the Crippled God. That is a found text outside the world of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And in this, the Crippled God is then going to explain all of the events leading up to him being freed. And each of the different events in all of the different books tie into an aspect of what the Crippled God thinks is important, that he is looking at all of these different thematic connections and explaining how certain characters got to be the way that they were for the events that free him and the events that were important to him and the events that shape things. So when we think of Memories of Ice and what happens to the Jagat Tyrant, in order to understand what happens to the Jagat Tyrant as this first moment where Itkovian takes on everyone's pain, this is the first time the Crippled God has understood this. But to understand that engagement, you have to know who the bridge burners are. To understand who the bridge burners are, you have to go back in time a bit, which means going back to the Siege of Pale. Now, they don't have to go all the way back, but understanding the Siege of Pale is enough to give you the context to understand what happens in Memories of Ice. So the Siege of Pale needs to be in there and what happens to the bridge burners. In order to understand where Tavor comes from, you need to understand how she ended up in that position, which means understanding who Ganos is and understanding who Felisin are. So they get added into the narrative because it explains Tavor, and the Crippled God shows us these things. And we see these through lines of connection, all because they are important to who the Crippled God is and what he is trying to remember in terms of the people who have sacrificed their lives for him, for his freedom, and taught him a lesson about humanity. When we see Bug and his relationship with Tehol and how Mael as an elder god changed through his time with Tehol, that is an important lesson for the Crippled God. All of these things are bound up in understanding, or the Crippled God's understanding of what happened. He is exploring these things. So that is the frame narrative that is setting up the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So he has borrowed all of this information. He has taken all of these events that ultimately led to him being freed, and that creates this entire narrative. But the thing to remember is the Malazan Book of the Fallen. So that was about the Book of the Fallen. The Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is the 10-book series that we can physically hold in our hands, is bookended by those things, which means there is another narrator. And that is the sort of the fictional narrator that we construct. It's an aspect of Erikson, who is creating this because he has told us with these poems, someone had to write those and narrate those to us, that's what this is. So it's like Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. This is creating the fictive reality to explain this thing. So it is nesting a story within a story, which explains editorial inserts and deconstructions of things, that is being told in a certain way, that it's trying to replicate the essence of one of these ancient texts that had multiple authors, that were constructed through different witness accounts and different variants of things, that someone went in and tried to compiled together. And like a clear example of this would be something like the Matter of Britain, where we get a lot of the Arthurian myth from. But the Matter of Britain was compiled from multiple different sources, was put together, and then over time, the Matter of Britain has evolved into various different iterations of the Arthurian legends, like Mallory and Credin de Troyes and all of these other authors who took the different sources about Arthur, who took the different Grail quest aspects, who took all of these different myths and compiled them together into a new narrative. That is what we are seeing here. So Kaminsod as narrator is the one framing everything within the Book of the Fallen. The Book of the Fallen then is being framed within this. So that's the sort of the nesting that goes on. So I hope that in some way explains the why Erikson keeps referring to Toll the Hounds as the cipher for the series. So thank you very much for watching. Greatly appreciate your support, and I'll see you in the next one.